Picture this. 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba erupts in what is now Sumatra. The explosion is so violent that it darkens the sky across the entire Indian Ocean. For months, the sun becomes a distant memory. Temperatures plummet. Crops vanish. Animals disappear. The world enters what scientists call a volcanic winter, a scenario so catastrophic that most of your species should have died. And yet, here you are. Your ancestors didn't just survive this. They survived it without knowing why it was happening. They had no weather forecasts, no supply chains, no governments distributing aid. Just the clothes on their backs, whatever knowledge lived in their heads, and an almost incomprehensible ability to adapt faster than extinction could catch them. That's the hidden story of human survival. Not the heroic narratives we tell ourselves, but something far more interesting. A pattern of how our psychology, our social structures, and our fundamental way of approaching problems allowed us to outlast catastrophes that left other species as fossils. When you look at what ancient humans actually did during these apocalyptic events, you don't find what you'd expect. You find something that challenges how we think about survival, community, and what makes a species truly resilient. The conventional story goes something like this. Humans survived because we were smart. We made tools. We cooperated. All true, but so vague it's almost useless. The real answer sits somewhere between our capacity to read environmental signals that others couldn't and a psychological mechanism that most people would call stubbornness, but is actually something more subtle. It's about how humans process information when everything around them suggests they should give up. It's about how we build social obligations that function as survival insurance. It's about the specific way our brains are wired to plan for futures we can't see. Consider what happened during the Toba eruption and the mega floods that preceded and followed various catastrophic events across human history. The survivors weren't the strongest. Fossil evidence and archaeological records show this clearly. They weren't necessarily the most intelligent in an IQ sense. They were the ones who could maintain enough psychological flexibility to change their entire way of living while simultaneously maintaining enough structure to keep groups cohesive. When the climate shifted, when food sources vanished, when the world fundamentally changed, these groups didn't panic into paralysis. They didn't cling to old strategies. And they didn't fragment into atomized individuals competing for the last scraps. Instead, they did something that should have been catastrophically inefficient, but somehow wasn't. They invested resources into sharing. Think about that from an evolutionary perspective, because it's genuinely bizarre. Your ancestors are starving. The world is dark. Game is scarce. Every calorie matters for individual survival. And what do? They spend energy maintaining social bonds. They share knowledge about where to find edible plants that most people wouldn't eat in better times. They organize hunts that distribute meat across the group rather than hoarding it. They tell stories around fires, which, by the way, costs calories just to gather the fuel and tell the narrative in order to maintain cultural memory about how to survive in different environments. This isn't altruism in the sense of modern morality. It's something closer to preemptive insurance. If I help you survive this year, you're obligated to help me survive next year. Except it wasn't framed as a transaction. It was framed as how things are done. This mechanism becomes even more visible when you look at how human populations expanded after catastrophes. Following mega floods in various regions, the Mediterranean basin, around 5.3 million years ago, though humans weren't there yet. Or more relevantly, The coastal megafloods as glaciers melted during the Pleistocene human groups didn't cower in caves waiting for the world to stabilize. They moved. They actively repositioned themselves into new environments. And this requires a specific cognitive capacity. You have to be able to hold a mental model of a place you've never been, based entirely on information from other people. An old hunter tells you that the lands to the north beyond the flooding have game. Water sources, shelter caves. You've never seen any of it. Your senses are telling you nothing but catastrophe. And yet you organize an expedition based entirely on second-hand narrative. That's not logical in a simplistic sense. It's something stranger. It's an ability to trust pattern matching even when direct evidence is absent. What's particularly interesting is how this shaped the kinds of personalities that became prevalent in surviving populations. Humans who were extremely risk-averse didn't tend to reproduce as much during these periods, not because they died more, necessarily, but because their psychology prevented them from taking the calculated risks that expansion and exploration required. Humans who were utterly reckless also had poor outcomes. But humans who could distinguish between recklessness and calculated risk, who could feel fear but act anyway, who could organize others around a plan despite genuine uncertainty, those individuals thrived. And more importantly, they raised children who inherited both their genetic predispositions and their behavioral models. You're looking at a kind of selection pressure that doesn't appear in genetics alone. The flood events specifically reveal something else about how ancient humans solved what we'd now call an infrastructure problem. Mega floods don't just destroy the local environment. They destroy the accumulated knowledge about that environment. Where are the water crossings? Which plants are safe to eat? Which animals are dangerous? Which caves provide shelter? When the Bosphorus flooded around 7,600 years ago, drowning massive swathes of coastal settlements, populations had to rapidly reorient around entirely new geographies. Archaeological evidence shows that populations didn't try to return to the old sites and rebuild. They migrated, and they migrated in patterns that suggest some kind of distributed knowledge. Different groups went different directions, but the movements show intentionality, not panic scattering. This suggests that survivors had some kind of mutual agreement about which groups would attempt settlement in which regions. It's organizational behavior at a level that required complex communication about future possibilities. Volcanic catastrophes created different pressures. The Toba eruption darkened the sky for years. Vegetation died. Animals starved. Humans couldn't simply move to a different environment because the environment didn't change locally. It changed globally. The challenge wasn't navigation or finding new resources. It was psychological and social persistence. How do you maintain group cohesion when people are literally starving? How do you prevent the collapse into tribalistic violence or warlordism that you might expect when resources become genuinely scarce? The answer, based on what we can infer from population genetics and the patterns of human expansion after Toba, is that groups maintained strict hierarchies of resource distribution, particularly around protein and fat sources. The evidence suggests that within these groups, certain individuals, likely the hunters and the old people with knowledge, were fed first. This sounds brutal, but it's strategically rational. A young person who dies of starvation can't be replaced. An elderly person who dies takes enormous cultural knowledge with them, but multiple people could have learned that knowledge if they'd lived to teach it. There's a psychological component here that gets overlooked. When you look at how humans actually behaved during these catastrophes, you see something that contradicts a lot of modern assumptions about survival. We assume that scarcity creates desperation. which creates competition, which creates violence and social breakdown. Sometimes it does. But in surviving populations, there's evidence of the opposite. Scarcity created kind of forced cooperation, and that cooperation became culturally embedded. Once you've survived a famine together, maintaining those social bonds becomes part of your identity. Stories are told about the terrible time. Rituals are performed to commemorate it. These aren't just cultural quirks. They're psychological mechanisms that keep the group from fragmenting when the next scarcity hits. And it will hit. Living in a world of volcanic activity and climate volatility, ancient humans understood this at a gut level, even if they couldn't articulate it. The next catastrophe wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. You were preparing your children for it. You were building a culture that could survive it. Now, here's where it gets complicated, and where most people stop thinking about this problem. The fact that humans survived apocalyptic events didn't mean they were particularly well adapted to them. Many populations didn't survive. Genetic evidence shows massive bottlenecks in human populations at various points. After Toba, human genetic diversity plummets. We're talking about scenarios where the global human population might have dropped below 10,000 individuals. That's not resilience exactly. That's a near-extinction event where barely anyone made it through. Some researchers argue that humans didn't survive because of superior adaptation. They survived because of luck. They were in the right geographic location when catastrophes struck. They happened to be in regions where volcanic ash didn't block the sun as completely, or where seasonal flooding was already a familiar challenge, or where enough migration corridors remained open that groups could escape. From this perspective, framing ancient human survival as some kind of achievement of culture and psychology starts to look like just so storytelling, like we're imposing narrative meaning on what was actually random chance. There's something to this critique. Luck absolutely played a role, but it's also incomplete. Populations in the same regions had very different outcomes. Genetic evidence suggests that some groups survived catastrophes that wiped out neighboring populations. The difference wasn't just location. It was how populations were organized, how they responded to the first signs of crisis, how they distributed information about alternative resources, and whether they had the social cohesion to act on that information. When archaeologists find evidence of human settlements that survived volcanic winters, those settlements show specific characteristics. They're positioned near water sources that tend to be stable during climate shifts. They show evidence of stored seeds and nuts. They display signs of coordinated settlement with other groups rather than isolated ones. These aren't accidents. They're choices, made by people who understood something about how catastrophes work, even if they couldn't explain it in modern scientific terms. The resolution to this paradox survival through both luck and design actually reveals something profound about how human intelligence evolved. We're not the strongest animals. We're not the fastest. We're not the most specialized for any particular environment. What we are is pattern-matching machines operating on incomplete information. Our brains are built to notice regularities, to build mental models of how things work, and to apply those models to situations we've never directly experienced. This capacity was forged in an environment of constant low-level catastrophe. Not every year was a volcanic winter, but enough years were harsh, unpredictable, or dangerous that populations who survived tended to be those that had built internal cultures around uncertainty. The people who made it through apocalyptic events weren't the ones who predicted those events accurately. They were the ones who had already spent their lives in psychological and social preparation for extreme scenarios. Because their culture had been shaped by previous catastrophes, they were ready for something, even if they couldn't have articulated what. And here's what makes this relevant to you. Now, in a completely different era of catastrophe, when you look at how your ancestors survived volcanic winters and mega floods without any institutional infrastructure, any external rescue, any technological advantage beyond bone tools and fire, the lesson isn't that humans are naturally heroic or that culture automatically solves everything. The lesson is that survival depends on a very specific configuration. Enough psychological flexibility to abandon what isn't working. Enough social cohesion to make collective decisions. Enough distributed knowledge that no single person's failure is catastrophic. And enough cultural memory that you don't have to rediscover solutions to problems that your ancestors faced. Most modern people exist in almost the exact opposite configuration. We're specialized for stability. We're dependent on systems we don't understand. We're isolated in individual nuclear families rather than embedded in networks. We've outsourced memory to devices we can't actually repair. Your ancestors survived the Toba eruption because they lived in a state of constant low-level adaptation. That was their normal. Your normal is increasingly the opposite, which means the lessons aren't about becoming tougher or braver. They're about understanding that the resilience that kept humans alive through apocalypses was built on flexibility, interdependence, and the active maintenance of useless-seeming social bonds. Those things still matter, even if the catastrophes have different shapes now.